Welcome to everyone to the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training's third in a series of virtual policy discussions examining From Trump to Biden, Reimagining U.S.-China Relations. I'm Mark Rincon. I'm an active duty Foreign Service officer and the Deputy Executive Director at ADST. ADST's business is history and diplomacy. We aim to strengthen public appreciation of American diplomacy and enrich professional knowledge by capturing, preserving, and sharing the experiences of U.S. diplomats in their own voices. We do this in two ways. One, through our collection of thousands of oral histories, and through our support and encouragement of authors who write about both. Oral histories are publicly accessible on our website and with the Library of Congress. So today we have a policy discussion that will examine regional responses to the US-China rivalry. It's the third in a series. It features policy experts and authors who contribute to our work via their books and discussions like today's. So during the event today, there will be a question and answer segment. If at any time during the discussion, you're welcome to use the Q&A box function to type in a question, and we will try and get to as many as we can. Today, we have a distinguished panel. I'd like to start by acknowledging Mr. Earl Carr, who's the founder and the chief executive officer at CJPA Global Advisors based in New York. Earl has more than 25 years of experience in research, analysis, strategy, and business development. He's the editor of From Trump to Biden, Reimagining U.S.-China Relations. He's an adjunct instructor at New York University's Center for Global Affairs. He's a fluent Chinese speaker, and he's also a member of ADST's board, so welcome to Earl. We have Winslow Robertson, the founder and the managing member of Cowries and Rice, a China-Africa strategic consultancy, which promotes sustainable business practices by Chinese organizations operating on the African continent. He's currently a PhD candidate at the Business School of the University of Navarra, located in Barcelona, and he's researching the intersection between ideology and management. We also have Oakila Kankawende. He's a data analyst at Insider Inc., and he's focused on solving complex business problems by leveraging data. Prior to his work at Insider, he worked as a platform operations associate at Money Management Institute, the industry association representing financial services firms and headquartered in New York. Welcome. And I'm also pleased now to warmly welcome Marilyn Waite. She's the managing director of the Climate Finance Fund. She's an avid writer, communicator. She studied at Yale. She's the author of Sustainability at Work, Careers That Make a Difference, and she's the editor at large at GreenBiz. Marilyn also serves on various clean energy and investment boards, and she brings a wealth of experience modeling and forecasting energy solutions to climate change. She, as well, is a Chinese speaker. She's based in Paris and brings a unique perspective of events currently taking place in Europe. So Marilyn will serve as our moderator, and she'll get us started. So I'm sure we're in for an insightful discussion. And Marilyn, I'd like to welcome you and turn the discussion over to you.
Mark, I'm sorry, it's not Yale, it's Princeton. That was a big mistake.
My mistake, my mistake. Sorry about that.
Marilyn, that was my fault. I thought you went to Yale, so I claim responsibility for that one.
Thank you for hosting this. I'm going to pass it to Earl for the survey part, and then we'll get to the panel.
Thank you so much. And first and foremost, I just wanted to say thank you to Mark and the exceptional leadership at ADST. The work that you all do is so important. And I also want to acknowledge individuals like James Fowler. There are so many people that are involved with this. These events don't just happen. And so I wanted to acknowledge Ben Reams and the leadership at ADST for making this possible. And a special thank you for Marilyn for being our exceptional moderator based in Paris. So she has a very unique perspective on what is going on with respect to Europe. Also, we have Winslow, who's based in Barcelona. So that's great as well. So as we've done with our third series, we will do a survey, which is really intended to get a pulse of where our audience is kind of on, where our audience kind of is on a number of geopolitical issues. And so we will go ahead and run the survey now. James, if you can start it. And we will continue to have a dialogue with our colleagues, myself, Marilyn, Winslow, and Oa, while you all take the survey. And typically when we have about 95% participation rate, I have full confidence, maybe we can get 100 today, we'll see. We'll go ahead and start the survey, and I'll run through the answers. What we've also done in the past is, if we have enough time, we'll run the survey again and see if people have possibly changed their perspectives or views on various issues. Normally with just an hour, we typically don't have enough time to do that, but just wanted to throw that out there, that's what has been done in the past. But I just wanted to just kick off, while people are taking the survey, I'm curious, Marilyn, given that you sit in Paris currently, what are you seeing? What is the pulse in Paris right now with respect to the kind of Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Obviously, it's put China in a very awkward position. As I think Prime Minister of Singapore said, particularly when you look at issues of sovereignty, these don't particularly play well with China's 5 principles of coexistence. But I think, I'd be curious to know what your sense is, being at the heart of Europe, if you will.
Great question. Well, I'm going to turn it back to you. I mean, I would say actually domestically in France, we're a bit consumed with the election. The first round of the French presidential elections are happening this Sunday. And there are some concerning trends post the Russian war on Ukraine. So watch this space, but I would say we're a bit consumed with that. Of course, there was an effort by President Macron to build bridges in peace earlier on that of course did not pan out. But let me, I will try to interject a bit on this as we go along. For each of you though, I would like you to tell us about what does the Russian war on Ukraine mean for US-China relations? And how about we start with you, Earl?
It's a great question. And I think for me, the fundamental issue that I focus on is, to what extent did China kind of overplay its hand with that critical statement? And that, I think for me, the picture of Putin and President Xi together at the Olympics sent volumes and sent, well, I mean, we will see fundamental repercussions of this for years to come. And there's kinds of two thoughts here. Did China overplay its hand? Like when this was going on, there's a perspective for many in the analysis community that at least at the highest level, Putin shared with President Xi that an invasion was going to occur. And I think when you see how united the United States and Europe were after Russia invaded Ukraine, I think there were many in China who were very divided. The fact that there were Chinese citizens that were stuck in Ukraine after, when the invasion started, right? So I mean, think that this is a PR nightmare to begin with. Number one, you had US providing intelligence to China and saying that, look, this war is happening. We are evacuating. We are telling our citizens to leave the country. But yet China is making none of these statements, right? So it's kind of a PR nightmare with respect to China protecting its own citizens, number one. Number two, China is far more integrated into the global economy and has far more to lose if China is also sanctioned with a number of business and commercial interests. And so I think China has been trying to straddle both kind of fields. And number one, they want to kind of be with solidarity with Russia, but at the same time, they want to be viewed as kind of a peacemaker. They want to be viewed as being able to ratchet down tensions in Ukraine by being able to provide humanitarian aid, etc. But at the end of the day, I mean, most people in Europe and the West say, look, China, you can't have your cake and eat it too. And, and the United States has been pressing the China to be able to kind of pick sides. But the reality is China's going to choose China. I mean, let's be real. I mean, China has no strategic interest to be able to kind of choose one side over the other. And I think that the broader implications is that China wants to be able to be kind of play both sides of the field, so to speak, and that's going to be in China's strategic national interest. But I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'll hand it over to Owa.
Thanks, Marilyn. Well, yes, it's a particular situation, as Earl put out, in terms of the PR, in terms of the public aspect, in terms of the global view of China's actions and how it wants to be seen, both in this moment and going forward. I think I'm going to take the direction of it from how does the world look like after this, and where does China sit in the midst of all of that? It's still very much, a lot of people have many opinions about what the world will look like, but it certainly will look quite different to the current world order with regards to the West and how it goes about its military actions, how it goes about its trade actions, especially in terms of energy, which I know we will be getting into a little bit later. I would say that China wants to be able to be a little bit on the observer side of things, but as Earl pointed out, given how they position themselves as a friend to Russia, it will be critical, depending on how the war plays out and depending on Russia's outcome in it, where one hopes that the conflict is resolved peacefully and there is not devastation and loss of life. If Russia can get out of the situation with some kind of a transition of to a more peaceful future, where it is not deemed a danger in the future, for in whatever way that may look like, politically, militarily, then China probably hopes that it will be able to continue its global activities in a relative amount of peace. However, if Russia does undergo numerous amounts of lasting effects via the sanctions, via how parties like the UN strategize and reorganize themselves as a global organization, then China's ties to it will ultimately drag it more and more into those very actions and into those very mechanisms. So I think it depends. I think they've now kind of, even though they will of course pick themselves in the end, I think that their history and given how they position themselves right before the conflict started means that China will likely, to me at least, gain an indirect part of the fallout from whatever happens with Russia towards the end of this conflict.
Thank you. Winslow?
Yeah, really briefly, I'm going to look at it for more of a China-Africa relationship. In that China is sort of trying to position itself as a sort of a third way in its own power, and actually a lot of African countries are uncomfortable with NATO because of Libya, or uncomfortable with sanctions. But they are uncomfortable not because China told them to be uncomfortable. They're uncomfortable because of their own domestic politics, their own history with colonial powers. So there's a confluence of interests in which China is trying to look like they're leading African stakeholders. They're trying to look like the big brother, third way world power that is helping navigate these geopolitical waters. But in actual fact, the UN resolution and the condemnation and the absentees and also the people that weren't in the room shows that in terms of African agency, that Africans themselves have a very particular view of Russia, Ukraine. It happens to match what China's doing when China is going to try and make political hay out of it and try and look like they're leading a multilateral group, when in actual fact they're not quite as much. They just happen to be aligned on this issue at this particular time.
Yeah, and if Marilyn, if I could just add one other quick point, I think it's critically important to understand that China does not have a strategic interest in seeing NATO enlarged, because in many ways, China looks at institutions like NATO similar to institutions like the Quad, which and ANCUS, which are really aimed at kind of what they perceive as kind of putting China down or kind of, containing China, in, so to speak. So I think that's an important dynamic. And I should also note that as we are on this call, the UN just voted to remove Russia from the Human Rights Commission.
I find that astonishing because there's still human rights abuses from both certain European nations, and for sure the United States. Okay, let's move on to the next question. For Owa. So in the book in chapter 5, so this chapter is the US strategy vis-a-vis China's presence in the African continent, description and prescription. You mentioned China's growing presence on the African continent results from a fundamental respect of the power of African markets and resources. What is China recognizing in Africa that the US and perhaps Europe is not? And what would be a better way forward?
It's a great question. I think I would start off with saying viability. I think that they see viability in those markets and in those resources, whereas the US and, for that matter, Europe, you could characterize them as seeing obstacles and roadblocks. As we sort of outlined in the chapter, there are many different reasons for this, but I'll kind of start out with the infrastructure path. The US private sector does not necessarily, and you can see it from their actions and from the way that things have gone over the past so many years, that the US doesn't necessarily see a roadmap towards interacting with these burgeoning markets, even though some of these markets, as the IMF pointed out in numerous reports over the past 10 years, that the markets on the continent in sub-Saharan Africa and in West Africa are the fastest growing and most powerful markets in the world. So why wouldn't you want to take advantage of that? Well, it comes down first to the private sector in the US is fundamentally different to the private sector in China. The private sector in the US largely moves of its own volition, and of course with government assistance along the way, but they want a easier road along the way. They don't want to feel as if they are under threat from infrastructure and governments that will hinder their profits in that space. And for a variety of reasons, certain African countries, whether truthfully or untruthfully, seem to provide those obstacles for them along the way. Whereas China's government, and it comes down to those differences in how Chinese business and its ties to the state government allow for an easier way towards doing that. When a bridge to allow for land trade of various goods and supplies gets built in West Africa, then that is done via Chinese state government funding and largely implemented by under Chinese government contracts, done by Chinese state companies with Chinese money that will ultimately recoup back into Chinese funds. Of course, this will also create jobs. This will also create more infrastructure that Africans and their own companies and their own governments can take advantage of. But in the long run, it's a way to expand your economic interest beyond your borders and gain a multitude of benefits from it, both economically and especially politically, which should not be forgotten, especially in this current time. As Winslow pointed out, many African countries are nervous about NATO and global groups like it and their expansion and their efforts, especially where it will run contrary to their own. Having that relationship with China expands that global soft power, expands that a kind of a shadow block of sorts that will protect these shared interests and protect these ideas around their own geopolitical movements in the future. Like on the US side of things, the difference in government structure, the difference in how the private sector and the public sector interact with each other is one of the many reasons that that the U.S. does not see the same situation in the same way forward. But it also does come down to history. It comes down to an unwillingness to move together. It comes down to many different things. And in terms of a way forward to get over these historical aspects and to get over the way that the governments are different from each other, the United States should try to recognize that Africans do see both the US and China favorably, that Chinese activities across Africa are not solely extractive and do in fact create jobs. And for the US to succeed in these areas, they should try to think about how do we both help African countries develop, be a business partner to them, but also try to make sure that there is a benefit coming to them in the long run from this. Then in terms of the more complex matters around debt trap diplomacy and the like, the US has an opportunity, and we outline in the chapter, to lead on the global scale in this area by illuminating transparency and implementing certain standards around how you define FDI and the like, and how you structure these packages around debt and which countries own it and the like. And then in terms of state financing, of course, the US, as I said, cannot necessarily shift completely towards China's model, but it can certainly get more creative than initiatives like AGOA and the like around how to create that runway for private entities on the US side to do business in and across Africa. If you clear some of these obstacles, if you make it viable for these companies, then they will be able to go further than just the luxury markets in which they are in now. For example, growing up, I always saw Apple products in and around South Africa, where I went to high school and some of my college years. But it was such a luxury product; it doesn't really go beyond the upper class. Whereas you would find Huawei phones everywhere, increasingly as time went on. It's a fact of Apple, a company like Apple, only seeing a route towards being a luxury provider of that good, whereas Chinese companies, with the help of their state government, for better or worse, actually do deliberate steps to interact with these markets in a way that they become the majority provider of goods like this at a rate that many more Africans can actually afford and can actually buy. And it's unfortunate for the African phone builder and provider that wants to get off the ground, but in terms of China's interest, it's what works. And finally, another way, and the last thing I'll just end off with is in terms of the future and in terms of the way that the US could creatively lead and be a different type of partner to where China has been on the continent, is in terms of the environment, especially with regards to the current energy crisis that is burgeoning across the world and the way that Africa wants to develop. It has currently developed a lot of its infrastructure with the help of China. But in terms of its energy, the US could step in and help with energy initiatives in various countries that go cleaner, that become more affordable and more accessible to many Africans. That will be actually a game changer and will catapult them ahead of China in terms of how what type of a partner it can be. So viability, creating a roadmap, and being creative and playing up to comparative advantages is the main points.
Thank you. Earl, did you want to go over the survey? Did I get that?
Yes, that'd be great. Before I do that, Winslow, did you want to say anything briefly before we run through the survey? Okay, great. So if we could just pull the survey up again, we'll just go through those results briefly. So we look at the first question: how do you perceive China's economic engagement in the United States? We see an overwhelming 53% as being very concerned. Question number 2: how do you perceive China's increased economic engagement globally? We see slightly less, with 47% concerned. Question number 3: what issue are you most concerned about in US-China relations? We see an overwhelming majority of 37% in a potential military conflict in the South China Sea or Taiwan. Question number 4: in light of the UN IPCC's 2022 report, who do you think should bear the majority of responsibility of mitigating climate change? And we see 47% say developed economies, i.e. the United States, Britain, France, Germany. Question number 5: what issue are you most optimistic about in US-China relations? 58% engagement on climate change and clear energy technologies. Marilyn, that should make you happy. Question number 6: do you believe China will be the strongest global economy in the world by 2030? 32% said maybe. Interesting. Okay. And question number 7: in light of current events, i.e. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how do you view China? And 58% said as a potential adversary. Okay, thank you. The reason why for question number 6, why I said that's interesting is because we've done about 47 book events now. And for that question, pretty much for the first 30 events that I've done, overwhelmingly, the vast majority of people said China would be the largest GDP. And now, after the invasion in Ukraine, I'm seeing numbers shifting now, maybe or unsure. So that's an interesting distinction. Over to you, Marilyn.
That is interesting. I mean, at the recent EU China summit, the European Commission reminded President Xi that the EU 27 nation bloc is its biggest trade partner with over 13.7% trade. The US is next at 12%, and then Russia at 2.4%. So I think the economic ties are still pretty strong, and that all has to be weighed and considered in this new context. So over to you now, Winslow. In this same chapter, chapter 5, you discuss the difference between Chinese investment and Chinese lending. Can you help us better understand the difference and how you see these concepts changing pre and post COVID, and perhaps even pre and post the Russian war on Ukraine?
Sure. I'm going to share my screen really briefly to use some slides to illustrate this. And as I'm getting the slides up, I'm going to try and basically, let's see, have folks just think about, just as a hypothetical, let's say you are a parent, you're a parent of twins, and both twins turned 18, and one twin wants to go to an expensive Northeastern private university, and in the mail, they get the acceptance letter. And another twin wants to open a business, and they'll go to Northern Virginia Community College while they're running a business. And the first twin says, hey, mom, hey, dad, listen, I got into university, but tuition's a little high. I'm going to need a $250,000 loan. And the second twin says, hey, mom, hey, dad, this business, it's an app. It's really getting off the ground. And I've got a $250,000 investment. As a parent, I think you might see the difference between your child getting a loan for university and an investment for a business. But what ends up happening is a lot of people in the China-Africa relationship will call the loan and the investment. And they're not. They're not the same thing. They operate fundamentally differently. And I really want to sort of illustrate that. This is a really, really quick slide. So here is a slide in which I'm looking at FDI flows in orange, which is a lot smaller. And loan commitments in green, which is a lot bigger, except for the year of 2008. When most people talk about the China-Africa relationship and they're talking about these eye-popping numbers, the roads, the bridges, the airports, as Owa mentioned, these are usually coming from Chinese policy banks lending to Chinese contractors. And everything is basically built on Chinese money getting to Chinese goods and services. It's not about the fundamental project itself being bankable. It's not about a business interest itself. It's basically Chinese money for Chinese goods and services. And it's fundamentally different than investment, which is usually a business idea about viability and about managing an asset for profitability and risk and reward. And you can see from these two different lines, one is a lot bigger than the other. But if you call both of them investment, you overstate Chinese sort of economic engagement, and you conflate all Chinese economic engagement with policy. And then also you kind of put yourself in a bad position in that as a policymaker, you are saying your country should not get investment. And you should never say that as a policymaker. As a policymaker, or as a partner for African countries, the policy tools you promote for American investment, maybe strong rule of law, IP protection, maybe environmental regulations, these will promote not only investment from American companies, they'll promote investment from Chinese companies. They'll promote investment from everybody. And that's okay because American companies can compete with all these other entities. But the policy tools to promote lending and debt sustainable lending are fundamentally different. And by calling them the same thing, the US boxes itself in and it ends up making itself into the bad guy, so to speak. And I'm not being facetious. If you look at Chinese and US foreign direct investment in China, the US had more foreign direct investment basically until about 2017, which, you know, for a lot of people, that's mind-blowing. China's investing so much, but China's not investing so much. China's lending a lot, but China's investing has been slowly, steadily increasing, but US investment also is quite similarly situated. That American investors and Chinese investors actually, when it comes to their own risk of capital, see these markets as more similar than not. And in terms of risk, if you look at Chinese global FDI stock, if you were to make a guess of how much Chinese money is going to different global markets, Africa makes a teeny tiny little portion of that block. China will invest in Hong Kong, and sure, that could be sent to Africa, but that could be sent to Europe, it could be sent to the Americas, that could be sent to other parts of Asia. And this is all a way of really trying to help folks understand that by saying the word investment, because investment is beneficial, you want one of your children, if they get an investment for $250,000, that's a good thing. That makes you proud. That's good for business. It shows a viability, as Owa mentioned. But if you keep using this language of investment, then the US is going to ultimately look like they just don't want investment, period. Last point of the slideshow, you'll see this when it comes to every year, every 2 years, there's a myth-busting article, maybe at Brookings or maybe in some of the DC think tanks. Chinese investment is not what you think. Chinese investment doesn't look like what you think. And basically what they'll do is they'll take maybe some of this data that shows that Chinese investment isn't just in mining, which is the big red bar, but it's in finance and it's in manufacturing, these real job-creating industries. And everything you thought about investment is wrong. Well, the thing is, these are using the definition of investment from the very first slide, which is the much smaller financial flow, the orange line. And it doesn't take into account the lending. And so if you are an entrepreneur, let's say you're interested in green energy, a Chinese policy bank will never lend to you if you're a foreigner, because they only lend to Chinese entities of a certain amount of money for certain projects. And if you think, oh, China is investing billions of dollars in green energy in Kenya, I want to get in on that. No, you can't, because as an entrepreneur, as an individual investor, you are not part of that policy area. But this is a really fundamental kind of misconception that everybody does it. Academics do it. Governments do. Oh, governments love to say they have investment. We got so much investment. We have all this investment. The Chinese are investing here. That it looks good to say that, hey, I brought in this investment. But it's really problematic for American public diplomacy perspective, but also problematic from an analytic perspective. Like, if you don't know the difference between one of your children getting a loan for college, another getting an investment for their business, and you say, oh, I got $500,000 of investment, that might lead to some huge misconceptions when it comes time for your children, your first child, to pay the loan back. And I'll stop there.
Wenzel, are you referring to the difference between debt and equity, essentially?
It's not just debt and equity. It's the idea of a Chinese policy bank. So when you hear about a road being built, that road being built generally is not built because it's bankable, because they think they're going to make money off a toll for the next 30 years. That road is usually built because somebody in the government wants that road built. Maybe they've wanted it built for 20 years. They call up the economic council, or the Chinese economic council, not the embassy usually, and they say, listen, we want the road built. Can you get us a project together? And the economic counselor will call somebody at a policy bank and they will put together not only the financing, but the insurance through Sinosure. They'll pull up a contractor, because usually the tied financing is the bank usually lends to certain contractors almost exclusively. And it's a turnkey project. That road is not built to be managed well. It's not an asset to be managed well by a Chinese contractor. It's built, handed over to whoever, maybe the relevant African ministry, Ministry of Public Works, and that's it. But that road has to be paid back. And the issue is, by calling it an investment, it implies a level of control, that China controls the road. But China doesn't control the road. The Chinese contractor is building the road. And on top of that, there is no incentive for a Chinese contractor to do a particularly good job. They just have to fill the contractual obligation of that building. But it's not debt versus equity. But yeah, if there was equity involved, because you'll see the projects that are equity investments tend to be managed a lot better. They're usually through a consortium of different financiers, because they're more complicated. There's and policy banks are a little it's a little harder for them to participate. But you do see spaces for actual investment with equity. And part of the definition of foreign direct investment, the technical definition, is an equity stake.
Yeah, I think it's a key part of what you're saying is equity. I mean, and it's worth saying that wealth is mostly built through equity, not through debt. Okay, just very quickly, because we're running out of time, we want to leave time for Q&A for each of you. On this energy and climate part, there are clear energy implications to the reaction of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The IPCC just released its latest report on Monday, pretty much saying it's now or never for climate action. And we are heading towards a 3-degree world. And it's the most pressing and pervasive emergency that the world faces today, the climate crisis. Are we responding to this crisis as the US did for during the Manhattan Project, as France did in the 1970s oil crisis, as Germany did in post-World War II reconstruction? What is the problem? And what would it take for the US, China, Europe, and Africa, or any of those that you want to talk about to move? Okay, so very quickly, let's go Earl, Owa, and then Winslow.
Sure. Great question, Marilyn. And you are one of the key experts on this. So I hope at some point we can get your perspective as well. And I'd love to also have you put your article. I'll make sure to put that in the chat for people to read as well. I think it's critically important that with respect to climate change and being carbon neutral, the United States and China are not working as collaboratively as they could be, in part due to the overall decline in U.S.-China relations, number one. I think that there's a pervasive view that right now there are more challenges than opportunities in Sino-U.S. relations, and policymakers are primarily focusing on ways that they should push back vis-a-vis China in terms of policy areas. I think the Ukraine is just one of them with respect to sanctions. When you look at kind of, historical administrations such as the Obama administration, when all else failed, kind of climate change was the silver lining, where at the end of the day, that's what anchored U.S.-China relations. And I think that's what's currently missing right now in this geopolitical inflection point, that there's a cacophony of different voices within the administration, and it's so hard to prioritize specific areas where we should be focusing on. I'll just leave it at that.
To kind of build off of that point, yes, it is essential with a moment like this in the climate crisis for superpowers to come together and to try to work collaboratively and try to be cooperative on this matter. It's especially tricky now given the Ukraine-Russia war, but I'll try to give a little bit on each. In terms of the U.S. side of things, it's going to be incredibly difficult to sort of retrofit everything to fit clean energy standards, but some of the policies that the Biden administration is attempting to put out, especially for matters like car manufacturers and also kind of the private sector's own leaning towards clean energy initiatives to play up to what consumers are showing more and more favor towards. More of that is certainly a good way to go. And with regards to the conflict itself, it does seem like a great opportunity while you are trying to not rely on Russia's gas exports, to try to use this as the chance to actually switch over even more so towards renewable energies in various manners. It seems like maybe a blessing in disguise in some way. Of course, it will be incredibly difficult. And then in terms of China, one of the saving graces of the way that the government operates, especially with regards to its state companies, is that top-down approach that it can take. And it does seem to be showing some signs towards trying to go towards renewable energies, but especially with how their Belt and Road Initiative is and how it's structured, and trying to implement those in more and more countries, and trying to work with those countries to adopt those energies, would be a bright step forward, including more cooperation with the United States. And just to end off real quick with Africa, as I kind of mentioned before, a lot of Africa, especially in terms of energy, is still relatively underdeveloped. Thus, kind of like how America has the opportunity now with the crisis to make that switch, many African countries and their energy sectors have that opportunity to pick clean energy as the energy mechanisms through which that they operate as they develop.
I'm very little add. Just China's because they finance a lot of energy projects. Their commitment to not financing coal is actually quite interesting, and I'm just going to share an article about them not financing a coal plant in Zimbabwe. And this is an example of China, Zimbabwe. They have close ties, but Chinese interest in not financing coal through these policy banks, it supersedes these diplomatic ties. But it's a much longer story, but this is interesting reporting, and I'll leave it there.
Interesting. So, in the recent EU Africa summit, there was serious pushback from African leaders, including Senegal, saying, how dare you refuse to finance fossil fuels in our countries? Meanwhile, you're continuing fossil fuel expansion in your countries. China just reopened 2 new coal plants that were previously uneconomical, heavy losses, and they just started them up again. And so I'm assuming that there may be the same pushback around a level of hypocrisy. I know there was a lot of push from the US and Europe on getting China to have that kind of policy in their overseas investments. So I feel like this new love of fossil fuels, which is neither just nor transitional, in Europe and in the United States, is actually detrimental to Africa relations and to our overall goals of the clean energy transition. We have one question I see in the Q&A for Winslow and Marilyn. Okay, for me, how is public opinion of China changing in Europe after the perceived connection with Russia and refusal to condemn them? Winslow?
My Spanish isn't good enough to read the newspapers. I defer to you. Please answer instead.
Well, I don't know how much public opinion there is on China. I mean, there's an elite Brussels-based opinion, but public opinion is something. So I would say, and it's also very national. The European Union only partially exists in terms of each country has their own sovereign policies to some extent. So, in the case of France, I do know that there's increasing support for Europe in general getting off of fossil fuels and away from Russian gas. And there's increasing support for nuclear energy. Of course, 75% of the grid in France is already nuclear, but there's increasing public support for that policy that was created in a time of crisis in the 1970s, oil crisis. So I don't know how much China is factoring in this. I think it is still quite inward looking because there's literally bombing and active warfare happening in Europe on at least, physically, geographically. And so I think there's more concentration in the general public on the humanitarian crisis, refugees, support, and somehow coming to an end for this and getting off of Russian gas as soon as possible. I would say the geopolitics of this doesn't really factor much into, I think, the everyday Europeans' perspective.
If I could just jump in and add something, Marilyn, what I find fascinating is when you look at the European companies that are operating in China and their perceptions after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The German Chamber of Commerce and the European Chamber of Commerce have come out with recent surveys. And I think one of the quintessential notions that they have argued is that, particularly for European businesses, they have expressed significant concerns about the impact of the war in Ukraine. For example, the German Chamber of Commerce did a survey. 46% of the responding companies currently see a decrease in the attractiveness of the Chinese market compared to the other markets. That's a significant figure. And I think that when you also factor in other companies that are doing business in European companies that are doing business in China, I see that there's going to be significant movement in their operations in the next 1 to 5 years.
Well, that was kind of the threat made from the EC side, the European Commission side of things, in terms of, are you sure you want to be so neutral in this case, given the amount of trade that's done with us and kind of the European presence in China, European corporate presence in China. It'd be interesting and I know that the lockdown, there's a severe COVID-related lockdown happening right now in Shanghai, which of course is the business capital of China, where a lot of foreign companies operate as WOFEs. I wonder if that might be furthering perceptions about the environment. I know that like the Tesla factories hasn't been running lately and things like that. So it might be a confluence of events that are leading to that perception. So I don't know if I'm doing a good job at looking at the questions in the chat.
We have a question from Hank Cohen has a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to call attention to the what happened in the second biggest rainforest in the world in Central Africa, the Congo Basin, covering 7 countries. The Chinese were busy cutting logs and exporting them, but as a result of a conversation between President Biden and President of the Congo, Tshisekedi, they stopped this activity. They prohibited the export of logs. So I just raising that as an example of how U.S. has been active working against Chinese doing bad things on climate change.
Thank you. If you have an article or anything on that, if you want to put in the chat, please do. Okay. Is there a question by Peng Yu, I think? According to the most recent FBI data, anti-Asian hate crimes rose 73% in 1 year. Also, it is not a hidden secret that the rise of nationalism in mainland China has been increasing at a surprising speed. What would you suggest to eliminate the misunderstanding between the two communities in the US? Anyone want to take that?
I'll start. I think first, Peng Yu, thank you for the question. And the issue of anti-Asian hate is very real. And if I can kind of tie this into broader US-China relations, I think it's critically important to understand that by being able to promote more study abroad of people from America traveling to China, I think that will really reap huge dividends in terms of them, coming back with a more nuanced understanding, being more culturally competent of people from China or for other parts of Asia. If you look at the number of American students that study in China every year, it's roughly about 10,000, according to the Institute of International Education. And that number has been declining over the last 3 years. If you look at the numbers of Chinese students that study in the United States, that's almost 290,000 students a year. And so I think it's critically important that if we want to have a more open, honest dialogue about anti-Asian hate, I think part of that comes from US citizens being more culturally attuned and culturally competent of all other cultures. And when you study abroad, it really changes you. I remember being a student studying abroad for the first time in Beijing in 1998. And, feeling like knowing that, I'm not the majority, what it's like to feel, to not be in the majority. And it really does change you. And so I really am a huge advocate for promoting more study abroad, not just in college, not just in grad school, but also at the high school level as well. The earlier we can get Americans to study abroad, I think the better for all generations.
Yes, I like that suggestion.
I would also add, Marilyn, I'm also a huge advocate for people, particularly in the African American community. My father is Black from Jamaica. I know Marilyn and I share a common heritage in Jamaica, but even in people from in the Hispanic community and others. I took 2 high school students from Spanish Harlem. They're from the Dominican Republic, and took them to Asia. I had a scholarship from the Institute of International Education. And I will tell you that it fundamentally changed their lives to be able to study abroad and to be able to, and they are able to connect with people from China. They spent 3 weeks in Taiwan. And because of that experience, they're able to connect with people from Taiwan, from China in a very, very unique way.
Right. And I think that with the current COVID policies, there's been less interaction between Chinese residents and non-Chinese residents, including students, which I think is really unfortunate. And I'm hoping that all of those things get eased very soon. Someone asked in the chat, did not the EU's parliament refusal to approve the EU-China investment agreement negotiated by the EU Commission indicate a problem? Yeah, things are tense. I mean, I would say the summit didn't go well, the business goes on as usual. The trading goes on as usual, but I think there's disappointment on the EU side of kind of China's more neutral position, which it perceives as not neutral, of course, for sure. So we have 4 minutes left. I believe there's something in the Q&A I missed. Okay. Could the global position of a US dollar be tanked by a new currency in the event of Russia-China rapprochement. I could partially take it if you go ahead, Earl.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think one of the questions that I often hear is the critical importance of the renminbi in Chinese renminbi, in the internationalization of the renminbi globally. And I think that it's important to understand that with China's acceptance of the renminbi in the IMF as a basket of currencies, that was really important symbolically for China's rise and more of the promotion of the renminbi. I think what I just recently traveled to Jamaica, and what I find interesting is that when you look and see how things like renminbi or the digital yuan can be utilized in countries like the Caribbean, in which if they were to trade in a currency that is cheaper than the US dollar, then you can see how that could be advantageous for a number of small entrepreneurs that are trying to do business and can utilize this to their advantage. I'll give you one other example as well with respect to the Chinese renminbi. If you look at the Caribbean, it doesn't make sense to have a bank on each island, right? Because it just the islands are very dispersed in the Caribbean. But if you can have a kind of digital currency that can be utilized, easily accessible, then you have better access to financial inclusion through a wider population in the Caribbean and other countries, I would argue, in Africa and elsewhere. So that's just one example that I'll say where I think you can see more usage of the internationalization of the renminbi taking more ground.
I highly recommend subscribing to Adam Tooze's Substack or newsletter. There's a great in-depth discussion on this. He's quite skeptical that Adam Tooze is a professor at Columbia University who wrote the book Crashed, by the way, and skeptical that this is an actual threat, but I think it's worth diving deep into. I mean, it could be a panel on its own for sure. It's important to note that a lot of even if something is being traded in a non-USD currency, for example, RMB, oftentimes underlying it somewhere, somehow, a swap, it's being done in US dollars. So it's quite complex, and the US dollar seems to have, it's beyond just the petrodollar now. It's so omnipresent and embedded in many things. But I do think it's important to watch this space, and also with the rise in, for sure, completely non-currency ways of transacting, including crypto. I think Mark is here to close this out.
Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you, Earl, Winslow, Owakele. This excellent discussion. Regrettably, I see that we're out of time, and we want to respect people's time as well. But I just wanted to say, hey, on behalf of ADST, on behalf of all of us, really thank you for this participation, for this discussion, and a reminder that the recording of this session will be made available in the coming weeks on ADST's YouTube channel. I just want to invite others as well. Visit adst.org. You're welcome to subscribe to our weekly newsletter, recommend us to friends, colleagues, or anyone out there who might appreciate a monthly dose of information about US diplomatic history in easily digestible form. So remember, ADST is a private nonprofit organization, and we rely on the generosity of our supporters. We'd invite you to support us on that note as well. If you're joining us for the first time, we'll look forward to your participation in future events. And I want to thank everyone again. Officially, this event is now over. Thank you so much.